Welcome back to r/Neighbors from Hell, where people share stories about their crazy neighbors. And if you're new to my channel, please don't forget to subscribe to join our amazing community. And without any further ado, let's dive right into the stories. And the first neighbor story starts like this. We had some neighbors that used to leave their garbage out in plastic bags the night before garbage day, instead of putting it in a bin. Around here, that is just ringing the dinner bell for raccoons and other critters. Sure enough, come morning, there is garbage strewn all over the neighborhood. What the raccoons and skunks did not spread around, the wind picked up the slack. Some of the people on the street kindly approached the guy and asked him to put his garbage in a bin. He told them to go F themselves. Thus began the garbage wars. Every morning of garbage day, some people on my street would collect all the half-eaten and rotten trash from their lawns and toss it back into the dude's backyard. He would collect it and then dump it back on their lawns. Or cram it into their bushes. People started finding half-eaten burritos and candy wrappers in their mailboxes. The street started to look like a slum. The police were called, health inspectors, city bylaw enforcement. Each side was calling in whatever authority they could muster to get their enemy in trouble. The dude and his family, amazingly his wife seemed perfectly pleasant, lasted about 8 months and then moved. Every once in a while I find a random margarine lid or piece of styrofoam in my hedge and my mind goes back to those dark days of war. And well guys, as you might know, war never changes. But in this case I do hope that the neighborhood gets a little bit smarter and does not conduct warfare by essentially polluting the environment with garbage. Honestly, that seemed very petty and ill-advised if you ask me. And now, neighbor story number 2. We lived on the bottom floor of a 2-story Victorian building. There was very little sound insulation between the 2 floors. When we moved in, there was a friendly older couple that had a dog. We could hear it running around, but honestly, no big deal. Then they moved out and these 3 young guys moved in. Seemed nice at first, but they turned out to be horrible. Officially, the rental agreement said quiet hours started at like 9 p.m. We basically told them, look, we are usually out of the house a lot and not home until late. As long as you are quiet by midnight during the week and 2 a.m. bar time on weekends, we are cool. This seemed incredibly reasonable to me. Within a couple of weeks of them moving in, it was non-stop crappy techno music being blasted at all hours. As we had said, we were not home much, so that didn't bother us all that much. What did was the Tuesday night parties going until 4 a.m. I would go to their front door to ask them to quiet down, and it would take a few minutes of ringing the doorbell and pounding before anyone would come down. Usually eyes were glazed over from either booze or drugs. I complained to their landlord multiple times, but nothing really fixed it. I finally just started calling the cops, and that would get them to stop for that night at least. The final straw was they had a party with easily 60 or 70 people, again not a big deal, until it was 3 a.m. and the club music was blasting and everyone decided jumping up and down would be a great idea. And by the way guys, how is a party with 60 or 70 people in a small apartment not a big deal? That seems absolutely outrageous if you ask me, but whatever. I actually could see the ceiling flexing. I finally sat down and wrote a cease and desist letter detailing the city noise ordinances and various other legal stuff that would give me cause to sue them and put it in their mailbox. Then sent it to their landlord as well. That stopped things, should have done it months before that. Finally, the landlord had enough I guess, because he came in and raised their rent to something insane like $6,000 a month. We live in an expensive city, but that was like 2 times the market rate at least. There was no rent control for this building, so they were out within the month. Was pretty glorious to hear them yelling at each other about finding a new place to live. And by the way guys, as much as I am happy about this landlord getting these awful people out of the building, it does kind of seem insane that the landlord can just raise the rent to an incredible amount like that per month, seemingly just out of nowhere. But I guess that is what OP means by saying there was no rent control for the building. Whatever that means, I am not sure. The next one is Neighbor Story 3 from Ask Reddit. Gather around, kids, so this neighbor thinks they are the mayor of the block. Rules for them but not for me. He goes around the neighborhood tracking which cars are expired on their times and calls the parking authority. If he sees a renovation or construction without a permit, he writes in a complaint and the inspectors come out and enforce. One time, I kid you not, another neighbor had someone plow a car through their back patio and fence. Once they started to demolish and replace, he called it in. Even the inspectors were pleading with him to withdraw it, but he didn't. So they had to get a permit because it was technically a new deck as the old one was demolished by them, even though they built it exactly the same way with the same previous company. He didn't like kids running on his front lawn, which wasn't all his, so he shoved glass all over it. Some parent called the cops and they hauled him out to pick it up. 2 weeks later he piled it with stones. In our area there's no law of adverse possession since the 1990s, but he doesn't think so. He keeps trying to lift his fence to all 3 of his neighbors a few centimeters, until one of them clues in and just knocked his fence over, which cut that behavior out. Even funnier, he needed to replace his shingles, so he saw his neighbor needed to replace theirs. So he complained, and then after the inspectors issued an order to fix both of them, he went to the neighbor and said his buddy could fix both their roofs and it was the only one he would let on his property. Their driveways were really tight. Well, the other guy gave 0 Fs, got on his roof and ripped off half his shingles himself and dumped them on butthole neighbor's property. He called the cops asked 0 Fs to clean it up. He said willing and able and more than happy to rip it all off and get it done so everyone can just get on with their lives. Butthole neighbor refused to let him on the property to clean it up though. Basically, at this point, the cops called the bylaw enforcement team and they let butthole neighbor know that he cannot complain that damage is occurring or a violation is occurring and then block any resolution to it. At that point, he basically cried like a baby about how life is unfair and no one follows the rules. He now just sticks to his property, but he keeps expanding his back deck and garage year over year without a permit, and is essentially covering his whole backyard with a new building, made out of scrap wood. So guys, the old and glorious rules for thee but not for me. Gotta love those neighbors. Either way guys, if you have watched until here, I would really appreciate it if you could post some star emojis in the comments if you want to support my channel, and furthermore, since YouTube is just so inconsistent nowadays when it comes to pushing out notifications about new uploads, I would really greatly appreciate it if you could turn on the bell button for my channel so you are always informed when I upload a new video. I just checked and around 20% of my audience turned on the bell notifications, which is yes pretty normal for YouTube, but it would be awesome if we could raise that number a little bit. Thank you so much in advance. And the next neighbor story starts like this. Our neighbors, a group of 20-somethings, moved into the upstairs flat of a 2-flat building with 2 very old women downstairs on a block of row houses. AKA houses that share walls but that were distinct buildings. They paid the first month's rent and maybe a deposit, but never paid another dime in rent. The landlord was not particularly competent and apparently he kept accepting their promises of future payment. Our neighbors hit on a bright idea for raising some cash. They advertised their living room as an event space and booked out-of-town bands who then advertised their weekly gigs on the net and in flyers around town. Our neighbors sold beer on the street and charged admission. The music shook our walls and terrorized the little old ladies downstairs. We owned and weren't going to be able to sell with these neighbors next door, so we were trapped. We never called the police, but our neighbors did. We called the landlord and complained. When he talked to the neighbors, they told him, "We are having rent parties," so he didn't stop them. We started sleuthing on the internet. We found bands advertising their gigs next door and wrote to the bands and told them they were performing in illegal spaces. We called the city attorney and he wrote to them and told them he would bring legal proceedings against them. None of that helped stop the parties. I learned to sleep in earplugs, but there were other problems. There were health code violations because they never paid their garbage bill and just let garbage accumulate. We found a cleaver in our backyard, probably thrown out their window. We had to replace our sidewalk because of cracks, and though we guarded the sidewalk most of the night, they still managed to scrape graffiti into our sidewalk, the traces of which are still there 20 years later. The final straw for me and for the landlord came when we found fireworks on our roof. I was livid because this went beyond discomfort. They could burn us in our beds. The landlord became afraid they would burn down his building, and finally, after several years, he evicted them. The saga of these neighbors from hell goes on, but it was a long time ago, and thankfully many of the details are hazy now. The next neighbors were very good, and though we were sad when they moved out, the new neighbors are wonderful. And I have to admit, Ripe Stars, in this story I don't really understand why the landlord did not evict these people earlier. They literally pissed off everybody around them, and I would assume severely decreased the property value of the landlord's home by doing all these shenanigans and giving him a bad reputation. And by the way, if you have any interesting Neighbors from Hell stories to share, please feel free to post them on r/ripe stories on Reddit, because there is a good chance that I might read it in a video. The next one is titled "Neighbor disliked how my garden looked. I complied with her demands, ends up with her raging." Have you ever had a neighbor that complained about every little thing on your property? A neighbor that constantly said your property is an eyesore? Well, I did, and let me tell you, it is nerve-wracking and annoying. Let me tell you how I got a healthy dose of revenge/malicious compliance on this neighbor. I am calling this pro-revenge because of the amount of work involved. But we have decided the work was worth it. For nearly 10 years my family has lived next door to a gentleman who lived alone. Ours is an historic neighborhood, double city lots with lots of hedges, bushes and trees to provide privacy. Also, I tend to be fairly easygoing about what others do on their own property. I really didn't care when our neighbor began illegally storing his large toys in his backyard. Due to the screening, I was the only neighbor who had to see his boats, ice house, teepee, yes, a full-sized authentic teepee. I never asked why he put one up. And so I never complained, and when he turned his home into a duplex without benefit of building permits or inspections and in violation of current zoning, I again never complained. I guessed he was now retired and needed the rent money. In any event, we have never had a problem with any of his tenants. Similarly, we never heard a peep out of him regarding our property. Not that we had any code violations or anything, but we did have a yard full of loud children and dogs for many years, and there was that one winter when we built a luge for the neighborhood kids that ran the entire fence line of our yards. And guys, I suppose a luge is similar to a sled, but please correct me if I'm wrong. Anyway, then our neighbor got a new girlfriend. I'm going to call my neighbor Andrew. His girlfriend will hereinafter be referred to as Sandra. Sandra quickly moved into my neighbor's home and began altering it as she saw fit. The first thing we noticed was that Andrew's neon sign collection was no longer visible through his windows. Ah, those bygone bachelor days. Then Andrew's backyard toys were all sold. No more carefree days spent fishing for Andrew. I am guessing the proceeds went to the new patio furniture that soon appeared. Also, a second new patio was built onto the side of the house because the backyard patio got too much sun for Sandra's taste. And since Sandra didn't want Andrew's cat spraying the new patio furniture, she made Andrew give the cat away to his son. That last one made me a little sad. The cat had been dumped in our neighborhood a few years back, and Andrew had seemed happy to have his little friend. But again, not our business. Finally, new landscaping was installed throughout their backyard. That also made me sad because the historic plantings that helped make our neighborhood unique were ripped out and replaced with McMansion-style beds filled with wood shavings and Japanese maples. If that was all Sandra did, I would have no problem. If Andrew was willing to put up with it, why should I care, right? But then she turned her attentions to our yard. First, she asked us to replace the historic fencing between our yards. Andrew offered to split the cost, so we agreed. The old fencing had seen better days, and the new chain link fence was quickly hidden by ivy and lilac bushes. Good neighbors, okay? Then Sandra decided that we were not cleaning up after our door quick enough and called out the compliance officer. In fact, we picked up after our dog daily, but at the end of each day, not after each dump. That is a personal ick factor of mine. I cannot stand picking up warm poop. The compliance officer told Sandra we had not violated any laws while giving me a heads up on my new neighbor. Strike one. A few weeks later, I had a knock at the front door. It was the landscaper who had done Andrew's yard. Sandra had called him out to my address without my knowledge or consent to provide us with an estimate. Estimate for what, you ask? Well, Sandra had suggestions for new flower beds as well as some trees she thought I should remove because they cast too much shadow on the back half of her yard. These were 2-story tall 80-plus-year-old oak trees. I apologized to the landscaper and sent him on his way, and my husband grumbled to Andrew that our yard was our business, not Sandra's. Strike number 2. Finally, Sandra decided our gardening shed tucked behind our garage had to go. I'll admit it was a rather utilitarian shed, but it was in good shape, fresh paint, and was heavily screened on all 3 sides by tall bushes. In fact, I only learned about Sandra's complaint because I found a city inspector wandering around my yard looking for the shed. Because of the way it was situated, the only way someone not actually in my house could see it was if they were hanging out Andrew's 2nd-story bathroom window. I kicked the inspector off my property and called my councilman to put a stop to the city's partnership with Sandra. It was then that I found out why Sandra wanted the shed gone. Turns out Sandra really just wanted the screening bushes gone. She had plans for a 3rd patio and fire pit for the back half of Andrew's yard. Sandra was worried, however, that the heavy bushes on the back half of our yard were encouraging mosquitoes, and she and Andrew wouldn't be able to properly enjoy their evenings by the fire. She figured that if she forced us to tear down our shed, we would then also tear down the screening bushes and her mosquito problem would be solved. Strike 3, Sandra, so time for some pro-revenge. Since we really didn't use the shed any longer, we tore it down. We also removed the screening bushes, and then we watched Sandra spend a few days harassing a couple of handymen who built her patio and fire pit. It was snugged up right against our fence and looked really lovely. Then we decided that as good citizens of planet Earth, we needed to be more environmentally proactive, so we installed a composting pile right where the shed and screening bushes had been located. After all, it is at the back of our yard and tucked behind the garage, so it really doesn't impact our enjoyment of our yard. And now every evening we take all our food scraps, potato peelings, coffee grounds, eggshells, watermelon rinds, etc. and add it to our large healthy compost heap. Every month or so we add some goat manure from our friend's farm. Turns out, goat manure is a cannot-miss addition for nitrogen-rich compost. Some shredded newspaper doesn't really look good, but it does help balance the carbon content. Late afternoons and early evenings, about whenever Sandra lights a fire really, one of us heads out to the composting and gives it a good turning. After all, a well-aired compost heap is a happy compost heap. Andrew and Sandra never said anything, even though compost heaps do add to mosquito populations. This one is titled, Am I the Butthole for Not Sharing My Driveway with My Neighbors? At the beginning of this month, my hubby and I moved into a new rental home. We loved the house, save for one drawback. The driveway is a shared driveway with our neighbors to the right, but we figured no big deal, we just stay on our own respective sides. Upon move-in, they were polite and came over and introduced themselves. They are our age, 3 roommates, and seemed super friendly. They said that the house had been empty for a moment and they were happy to have new neighbors. They have 3 cars, we have 2. For the past 2 weeks we have parked our cars on our side of the driveway, one in front of the other. They have done the same on their side. Last night the neighbors come home from their respective jobs and approach us. My husband and I were sitting on our porch chatting. They told us that in the past, the previous tenants of our home would park on the street, giving them full access to the driveway, and asked that we do the same. They all leave for their respective jobs at different times every morning, and they hate having to shovel cars around. I work an 8 to 5, so my schedule is set, and my car is always parked in front of our second car. Additionally, it is important to note, my husband is a stay-at-home father, so our second car sits most days. and their argument is that it is just in the way. However, the second car is also the car with the car seat for our infant child, and if they ever needed to leave, I don't like the idea of him having to load up from the street. We had a car demolished recently because a texting driver was speeding and not paying attention and drove straight into our street parked car. I told them I'm not comfortable with having to street park for their convenience. It is my driveway and I shouldn't have to compromise just because previous tenants did. Their argument is that we have one car that could sit on the street just as easily as it sits in the driveway, and that my car could also be street parked because I leave after them and get home before them, making their parking more difficult. Am I the a-hole? Edit, I have a lot of people asking about them street parking instead of us. I guess I should clarify their arguments on that point. A, they claim they have newer cars, but so do we. B, the way that our street is set up, they don't have as much street space in front of their house. We can fit 2 cars in front of our house, but they could fit 1 tops, leaving them to have to park in front of someone else's house. I'm so sorry for not being clearer about these points, as it may change judgment. And a user in the comments said, not the a-hole, you pay for that driveway space, it is your choice. Just because it is inconvenient for them doesn't mean you have to change your life. They should probably try to figure it out amongst themselves, as they chose the place knowing it was a shared driveway. You are so not the a-hole. Another user said, not the a-hole, your rent includes your driveway, if they wanna use it, make them pay. Just because it is more convenient for them doesn't mean you should do it. You should use the space even if one of your cars sit idle most of the time, they are not entitled to it. And ripe stars, after hearing these opinions, I would love to know what you think about this story. Do you think that OP is the a-hole or not? In addition, since some people in the comments asked for it, I will just talk a little bit about what is going on in my life currently, which is actually not much, which doesn't really mean it's going bad or anything. However, simply at the moment the pandemic situation in Thailand, especially here in Bangkok where I am situated now, is quite bad. This means the cases are rising and the ICUs are getting fuller and fuller, and therefore the government is doing more and more lockdowns. To be honest with you, for almost the entire last year, Thailand was pretty much perfectly fine when it came to the pandemic. There were no major lockdowns, we could go anywhere we wanted, we could go to restaurants, everything, but now you can really tell that poop is hitting the fan. That also means that I don't really have that many interesting things to talk about because most of the time I am just staying in my apartment together with my girlfriend because there's simply not that much to do since almost everything is closed. Also, I am still waiting for a good vaccine. We already pre-ordered Moderna, which is supposed to come in October to Thailand, so I hope we get lucky there. But yeah, that is all from me. The government also announced that they might do a Wuhan-style lockdown soon, which I am definitely not looking forward to, but who knows. All in all, I am good, I'm just staying at home a lot and making videos for you guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I see you again tomorrow.